Disclaimer: it's inspired by reality, shaped by imagination.
What happens when Hollywood's smoothest talker walks into daytime TV's most combative arena? Matthew McConaughey thought he was sitting down for a friendly chat on The View, ready to talk about balance, family, and his latest project. Instead, Joy Behar decided to test his calm Southern charm with a line of questioning that went from skeptical to downright personal. At first, Matthew leaned back in that easy Texas drawl, smiling through the jabs. But when Joy accused him of being out of touch with everyday Americans, the mood shifted. The studio audience could feel it, the temperature rising, the laughter thinning, and McConaughey's trademark cool starting to burn with something sharper. No one expected what came next. For a man known for his measured words, Matthew suddenly dropped the script and fired back with raw honesty that left the entire table stunned. Gasps filled the studio, cameras zoomed in, and Joy didn't know whether to double down or back off. By the time it was over, Matthew McConaughey had delivered one of the most explosive moments in The View's history. And the fallout would spread far beyond that morning's broadcast. The studio lights glowed warm against the backdrop of The View's familiar set, the buzz of the live audience adding a charged energy to the morning. Whoopi Goldberg, as always, set the tone. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a real treat for you today. Academy Award winner, best-selling author, and man of many hats, please welcome Matthew McConaughey. The audience erupted into applause as Matthew strolled on stage, flashing that famous grin, hand raised in a casual wave. Dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a little undone at the collar, and his signature boots peeking under his tailored pants, he looked relaxed, like a man who had nothing to prove. All right, he drawled, prompting the audience to cheer louder. He hugged Whoopi, shook Sonny's hand, nodded at Anna, and even leaned in for a friendly pat on Joy Behar's shoulder. She smiled politely, though her eyes already carried a mischievous gleam. "Matthew, we're so happy to have you here," Jennifer Hudson said warmly. Matthew chuckled. "It's good to be here. I've been on a whirlwind, but I love sitting down, slowing down, having a good talk. That's what this is about, right?" Whoopi leaned in. "So tell us about this new project. You're building something that mixes wellness with storytelling." Matthew launched into his trademark mix of philosophy and charm. "You know, life's a balance. I've been thinking about how we spend our days. My new thing is about giving working folks, moms, dads, seniors, tools to find a little more time, a little more grace. I call it rhythm management. Because if you don't find your rhythm, life just feels like noise." The audience clapped. Anna nodded thoughtfully. Sonny scribbled notes, but Joy Behar tilted her head, one eyebrow raised. "That sounds nice, Matthew," she said, her voice tinged with skepticism. "But isn't that just privilege talking? I mean, a single mom working 2 jobs doesn't have time to think about her rhythm. She's just trying to pay rent." The air shifted instantly. The audience gave a soft ooh, recognizing the challenge hidden in Joy's words. Matthew's grin faltered, though he kept his posture open. "Well, Joy, I hear you, but I grew up in a small town in Texas. My folks didn't have a safety net. My dad worked the oil fields, my mom taught school. We didn't talk about wellness. We lived paycheck to paycheck. But even then, we had to find moments. My mom used to say, 'Matthew, if you don't stop to breathe, you're going to suffocate on your own ambition.' It's not about privilege, it's about perspective." The audience applauded, sensing his sincerity. Joy crossed her arms. "But you're not exactly the voice of the working class anymore, are you? You're Hollywood royalty now. Easy for you to say, 'Find your rhythm,' when you've got staff and assistants." A nervous chuckle rippled through the crowd. Whoopi interjected lightly. "Oh boy, we're already stirring the pot." Matthew leaned forward, his smile thinner this time. "Joy, I'm not here to sell some fantasy. I'm here to talk about habits that matter no matter what's in your bank account. I've been broke. I've been flush. The rhythm thing, it works both ways." Sonny nodded in agreement. "I think what Matthew is saying is universal. Everyone's got stress, but it's fair to ask who has the resources to apply those tools." Matthew smiled at her. "Exactly, and that's the conversation worth having." Joy tapped her pen on the table, unconvinced. "Well, I think people watching at home want more than catchphrases. They want real answers, not Hollywood philosophy." The audience gave another uneasy murmur. Matthew glanced at her, the easygoing charm dimming just a notch. He replied softly, "I'd argue real answers come from real experiences, Joy, and I've had mine." The table went quiet for a beat. Whoopi broke the silence with a chuckle. "Looks like we're just getting started." The spark had been lit. What was meant to be a breezy conversation about wellness had shifted into a subtle duel of perspective. The audience could feel it, the tension curling beneath the laughter, ready to break open into something bigger.
The audience's polite laughter still lingered in the air, but everyone on set could sense that the temperature had risen. Joy adjusted her glasses and leaned forward in her chair, her tone sharp but measured. "Matthew, you're a likable guy. Nobody's arguing that. But when you sit here and tell people who are drowning financially to just find their rhythm, it sounds dismissive. People don't want philosophy. They want solutions." The audience gave a low murmur of agreement. Some clapped at her directness. Matthew shifted slightly in his seat. He folded his hands, elbows resting on the table, and tilted his head at Joy, as though trying to decide whether to smile or push back. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but more pointed. "You're right, Joy. People do want solutions. But sometimes solutions don't come wrapped in legislation or handouts. They start inside. A change in mindset, a change in how you walk through the day. If you don't anchor yourself, even when things are rough, then the storm's gonna knock you down every time." Before he could continue, Joy cut in. "Easy to say when you've got millions in the bank." The audience gasped. A woman in the front row even said out loud, "Wow!" Whoopi quickly tried to mediate. Hold on, let him finish." Matthew's eyes narrowed for just a second, but then he let out a dry laugh. "You know, Joy, I didn't show up here to brag about my bank account. I showed up to talk about something I believe in. You want to talk about money? I'll tell you this. I've lost money. I've been scammed. I've been flat out broke before anyone knew my name. That stuff doesn't define your character. How you handle it does." The crowd clapped loudly this time. Joy smirked, unfazed. "But Matthew, the majority of Americans can't handle it because the system is stacked against them. Don't you think celebrities like yourself sometimes ignore that reality? You go around preaching optimism, when for many, optimism doesn't pay the bills." Ana Navarro jumped in, her voice sharp. "Joy, let's be real. Just because someone's successful now doesn't mean they can't understand struggle. Matthew's not saying money problems vanish with good vibes. He's saying how you face challenges matters. There's a difference." Sonny Hostin nodded. "I agree with Ana here. I think Matthew is speaking from a place of life experience, not just privilege. We can't always reduce a person's point of view to their current bank account." The applause meter shot up again. Clearly, the audience was divided, but engaged. Joy wasn't backing down. She leaned closer to Matthew, lowering her tone as if to make it personal. "But don't you think it's a little insulting? Coming here, telling struggling parents or seniors that all they need is a mindset shift? That's not the reality they're facing." Matthew sat up straighter now, no trace of his earlier laid-back ease. His voice grew firmer. "Joy, what's insulting is assuming people don't have the strength to rise above their circumstances. You underestimate them. You say they need saving. I say they need reminding that they've got the power inside them already. The audience erupted into cheers and applause, some even giving a standing ovation. Joy's lips tightened, but her eyes glinted. She knew she'd struck a nerve, and so had he. Whoopi tried to lighten the tension with a chuckle. I knew this table was gonna be hot today. But Joy wasn't laughing. So are you saying government doesn't matter? Programs don't matter? That people should just bootstrap their way out of poverty? That's dangerous talk, Matthew. Matthew leaned forward, his elbows on the table now, his voice dropping low but steady. I'm saying you can't outsource personal responsibility, Joy. The government can lend a hand, but if people wait for it to fix everything, they're going to be waiting forever. Another gasp from the crowd. Some clapped furiously, while others shook their heads. The co-hosts exchanged uneasy glances. The clash wasn't just heating up, it was boiling over. Matthew McConaughey, usually the picture of calm wisdom, was now locked in a verbal duel with Joy Behar, neither willing to yield. The audience could feel it building, moment by moment, towards something explosive. The tension was no longer subtle. It was front and center, electrifying the entire studio. The studio had grown uncomfortably quiet, the kind of silence that only happens when an audience senses something real about to break loose. Joy's eyes locked on Matthew, sharp and unyielding, as if daring him to keep going. She tapped her pen against the table. Matthew, what you're saying sounds good in a book or a graduation speech, but for families who are choosing between rent and groceries, your philosophy doesn't put food on the table. You're giving people hope when what they need is help. Isn't that a little out of touch? A few in the audience clapped, but others hissed under their breath. The tension was thick enough to taste. Matthew leaned back, rubbing his jaw, clearly deciding whether to let it slide or respond. He finally sat forward, his Texas drawl steady, but edged with something more raw than before. Out of touch. Joy, do you know what it feels like to be down to your last dollar, sleeping on a friend's couch with no idea if you'll ever get a chance to prove yourself? I do. I live that. And let me tell you, what kept me going wasn't a government check, and it wasn't someone patting me on the back. It was a decision I made every single morning to keep showing up. The audience clapped, but Joy wasn't moved. She crossed her arms. You had talent, you had opportunities. Let's not pretend your story is the same as the average American's. That was the strike that landed. Matthew's smile vanished. He pressed his hands together as if trying to hold back a flood of emotion. You think talent's enough? Joy, you're wrong. I was one rejection away from giving up. One. I had nights I cried myself to sleep because I thought I'd never make it. I know what it feels like to think you're invisible. The room shifted. The audience leaned forward, sensing Matthew was speaking from a place he rarely opened. Joy, perhaps unintentionally, pressed harder. But look at you now, Matthew, an Oscar winner, millions in the bank. Isn't it convenient to talk about resilience once you're sitting on top of the world? The air cracked. Matthew slammed his hand lightly on the table, his voice rising for the first time. You think success erases the scars? You think just because I made it, I don't remember what it was like to struggle? Those memories never leave. The fear, the doubt, the shame. You carry it with you. And maybe that's why I speak the way I do, because I know how close I came to giving up. And I don't want anyone out there to quit when they're just one step away from breaking through. The crowd erupted in applause, whistles echoing around the studio. Whoopi raised her eyebrows, clearly impressed by the rare vulnerability from the famously cool actor. Joy tried to cut in, but Matthew kept going, his voice cracking slightly. You call it philosophy, I call it survival. My mom cleaned houses, my dad worked oil rigs. We didn't grow up with safety nets. When I failed, it wasn't theory, it was real hunger, real bills we couldn't pay. So don't tell me I don't know what struggle looks like. I've stared it in the face. The studio went quiet again. this time in reverence. Even Joy shifted uncomfortably, realizing she had drawn something raw and unfiltered out of him. Sonny Hostin leaned forward gently. "Matthew, that's powerful, and it's true. Struggle is universal, even if it looks different for each person." Ana Navarro chimed in, "I think what Matthew is saying is people need both, support from the system and strength from within. It doesn't have to be one or the other." Matthew finally leaned back, exhaling as though he'd released years of weight. He nodded slightly at Ana. "Exactly. I'm not saying government doesn't matter. I'm saying it's not enough by itself. People need belief. They need to know they're capable. Otherwise, even if you give them help, it won't last." The crowd applauded again, some standing. The cameras caught faces of audience members wiping away tears. Joy still wasn't entirely softened. She shook her head. "But Matthew, don't you see, when you tell people they already have the power, you risk letting those in charge off the hook. They'll say, 'See, people don't need us to fix the system. They can just think their way out of poverty.' That's dangerous. That's what I'm fighting against." This time, Matthew didn't get angry. His voice softened, almost breaking. "Joy, maybe you're right to fight. Maybe I'm right to remind. Maybe both are needed. But don't accuse me of being out of touch just because I still believe in people's grit. Because I've seen what happens when someone gives up hope, and it's the worst thing in the world." The silence afterwards was deafening. Even Joy didn't have a quick comeback. The camera zoomed in on her face as she adjusted her glasses, suddenly less sure. The clash had gone from heated debate to something else entirely. A raw, emotional moment where the stakes felt real, not just for Matthew and Joy, but for everyone watching.
The mood in the studio was fragile, like a glass balancing on the edge of a table. Everyone knew the conversation had moved past polite disagreement and into something raw. Matthew sat tall, his jaw tense but his eyes focused. Joy leaned forward, gripping her mug like it was armor. The other hosts glanced nervously at one another, trying to gauge whether to step in or stay out of the storm. Joy finally broke the silence, her voice sharp. "Matthew, you're a great storyteller. Nobody can deny that, but what you're saying still sounds like a fairy tale. Hard work, grit, resilience, it's the American dream wrapped in a Hallmark card. But dreams don't pay medical bills. Dreams don't buy insulin. And when you stand here preaching survival, you risk dismissing the very real systemic issues people face every day. That's reckless." The crowd gasped. A few clapped in support, but the mood was split. Matthew tilted his head, his famous half-smile gone. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Reckless, Joy? You just called my life reckless. You called my mom and dad reckless. You called every working-class family out there who clawed their way through the mud reckless. You don't have to agree with me, but don't you dare dismiss the people who are fighting every single day to make it." The audience roared. Some even stood up, clapping, as if they'd been waiting for him to throw down the gauntlet. Joy didn't flinch. She shot back, louder now. "Don't twist my words, Matthew. You're sitting here with privilege, yes, earned, but privilege nonetheless. And you're telling people that if they just believe hard enough, they can have what you have. That's toxic optimism. That's selling false hope to people who deserve real solutions." Whoopi tried to interject. "Okay, let's—" But Matthew cut her off, his voice suddenly booming. "No, Whoopi, let's not. Let's get this straight. I've never told anyone they can just believe their way to a better life. I've told them they have to fight for it. You think I don't know the system's broken? Of course I do. But waiting for someone else to fix it while you sit there hopeless, that's the real poison. That's what breaks people." The crowd erupted again, this time louder, split between cheers and gasps. The energy was electric, impossible to ignore. Joy's face flushed, but she didn't back down. She leaned in so close to Matthew that the camera had to zoom out to keep them both in frame. "You think you're inspiring, Matthew, but you're not listening. You're speaking from the mountaintop while people are drowning.
That's what makes me furious. You act like struggle is some badge of honor, but for millions of Americans, it's a life sentence. And telling them to just dig deeper, that's cruel. For the first time, Matthew stood. The studio audience gasped. He didn't yell. His voice was firm, low, and cutting. You know what's cruel, Joy? Telling people they're powerless. Telling them the deck is so stacked they shouldn't even try. You think that's compassion? That's surrender, and I'll never tell people to surrender. The audience broke into thunderous applause, some chanting his name. The camera panned to fans in the crowd who were visibly emotional, one woman wiping tears from her cheeks. Joy, still seated, looked up at him, her voice cracking with frustration. You don't get it, Matthew. You just don't. Not everyone gets a Hollywood ending. Matthew placed both hands on the table, leaning down slightly, his eyes locked on hers. You're right, Joy. Not everyone does. But everyone deserves the chance to try. And when you tell them it's hopeless, you're stealing that chance. That's not a debate point, Joy. That's life or death. The words landed like a punch. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was devastating. The weight of what he said hung in the air like smoke. Even Joy seemed shaken, shifting uncomfortably in her chair, unable to meet his eyes. Sonny Hostin gently touched Joy's arm, trying to soften the moment. Maybe both of you are fighting for the same thing in different ways. Joy wants the system fixed, Matthew wants people to find their strength. Maybe we need both. But Matthew didn't sit down. He scanned the audience, his voice quieter now, but carrying more power than before. Listen to me. Every one of you out there, don't let anyone tell you you're powerless. Don't let anyone, no matter how well-meaning, convince you your fight doesn't matter. Because if you believe that, you've already lost. The audience exploded into a standing ovation. Joy pressed her lips together, visibly rattled. Finally, Matthew straightened, exhaled, and sat back down, though the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. Joy, shaken but unwilling to concede, muttered under her breath, "You're romanticizing suffering." Matthew turned his head toward her, his voice firm but final. "No, Joy, I'm honoring survival." The crowd roared so loudly that the producers had to cut to a wide shot to capture the chaos. Applause, cheers, a few boos. The hosts looked stunned. Even Whoopi, usually the peacemaker, looked at Joy as if silently asking why she'd pushed it this far. This was no longer just a debate. It was a showdown that had cracked open something deeper. Matthew's raw conviction colliding head-on with Joy's unrelenting criticism. And in that collision, neither was willing to bend. The breaking point had arrived, and the scars from it would linger long after the cameras stopped rolling.
The moment the cameras cut to commercial, the studio was buzzing like a hive that had just been shaken. The audience was still on their feet, some chanting Matthew's name, others muttering that Joy had crossed a line. The co-hosts leaned in close, whispering to each other, while Matthew sat back in his chair, silent, the intensity still written across his face. Joy kept her eyes fixed on her mug, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted it. When the show resumed, the producers made the decision to pivot quickly. Whoopi cracked a joke to lighten the mood. Sonny tried to offer a diplomatic summary, and Ana Navarro steered the conversation toward a pre-scheduled, lighter segment. But the tension never really left. Matthew had struck a chord, and Joy's usual quick wit couldn't quite cover the bruise left behind. By the next morning, the moment was everywhere. Clips of Matthew standing, leaning over the table with that steady, unwavering voice flooded social media. Headlines screamed across news outlets. Matthew McConaughey schools Joy Behar on national TV. Daytime clash turned explosive as Matthew refused to back down. Even those who had only caught sound bites understood it was more than an argument. It was a cultural flashpoint. Fans online rallied behind Matthew. Tweets poured in from people thanking him for standing up for the working class, for voicing what so many felt but rarely heard on mainstream platforms. Some shared personal stories, saying his words about survival had reminded them of their parents, their grandparents, or even themselves. The hashtag #HonorSurvival trended for days. But it wasn't one-sided. Joy had her defenders too. Commentators on progressive platforms argued she was right to call out systemic inequality, and that Matthew's fiery optimism risked oversimplifying deeply entrenched problems. They praised her for refusing to back down to a Hollywood star, and for speaking uncomfortable truths even if her delivery had rattled viewers. The divide spilled into morning radio shows, podcasts, and even late-night comedy. One comedian joked, "Matthew McConaughey came on The View to sell a book and ended up nearly flipping the table." Another quipped, "Joy Behar found out the hard way that Matthew isn't just all right, all right, all right. He's ready to fight, fight, fight." Behind the scenes, though, the clash weighed heavily on Joy. For years, she had been the loud, unapologetic voice on The View, quick with sarcasm and sharper still with her political barbs. But this time was different. Matthew hadn't brushed her off or snapped back with humor. He had challenged her on something deeper, her worldview, and the rawness of his conviction made her look less like a witty critic and more like a cynic. Producers reportedly urged Joy to let the moment pass, to avoid escalating it in future episodes. But those close to her said she couldn't stop replaying his words in her head. "No, Joy, I'm honoring survival." That line had cut through all her defenses. Matthew, for his part, kept relatively quiet after the show. In an interview days later, he didn't gloat or pile on. He simply said, "I care about people finding hope in the middle of the mess. If that ruffled feathers, so be it. At least the conversation's happening." That restraint only boosted his credibility. The legacy of the clash wasn't just about who won the argument. It became a symbol of two competing American narratives colliding in broad daylight. On one side, the belief that systems must be dismantled and rebuilt to protect the vulnerable. On the other, the conviction that no matter how broken the system, the human spirit cannot afford to give up. In the weeks that followed, civic groups and talk radio stations began hosting town halls framed around the very question the clash had raised. How do we balance systemic change with personal responsibility? Educators cited the moment in classrooms as an example of rhetoric, conflict, and persuasion. For once, a daytime TV debate wasn't just a viral spectacle. It was sparking real conversations across kitchen tables and coffee shops. For Joy, the encounter left a bruise on her reputation. Some viewers felt she had gone too far in her personal attacks, and while her longtime fans defended her, casual viewers saw her as shaken. For Matthew, the clash became another notch in his belt of authenticity. Hollywood star or not, he had stood on that stage and spoken with the cadence of someone who had lived the struggle, not just read about it. Months later, when The View aired a highlight reel of biggest moments, the producers leaned into the clash. The clip of Matthew declaring, "No, Joy, I'm honoring survival," closed the reel to thunderous audience applause, cementing it as one of the most memorable exchanges in the show's history. The legacy was clear. This wasn't just a fiery debate. It was a cultural mirror, reflecting how divided yet deeply invested Americans are in the question of resilience, fairness, and hope. And for better or worse, Matthew McConaughey and Joy Behar had given that debate a face, a voice, and a moment that no one would forget.